I was standing in my backyard in Asheville, North Carolina, staring at my fence with my mouth hanging open like I just witnessed someone key my truck right in front of me. The pristine white picket fence that I'd spent 3 weekends meticulously painting last month now looked like it had been attacked by a blind painter with a vendetta against good taste. Someone had slapped a coat of beige paint over my work, and not even a decent beige. This was the color of watered-down oatmeal left out in the sun for too long. My name is Stephen Owens, and I'd lived in the Meadowbrook Hills community for exactly 8 months. When my wife Sarah and I bought this place, the realtor had glossed over the HOA part like it was no big deal. Just a small fee, she'd said, keeps the neighborhood looking nice, she'd promised. What she hadn't mentioned was that the HOA president was a woman named Patricia Hendricks, who apparently believed she was the supreme ruler of a small fiefdom rather than the head of a voluntary neighborhood organization. I pulled out my phone and called Sarah, who was at work teaching 3rd grade at Asheville Elementary. She answered on the second ring, and I could hear children's voices in the background. "Stephen, I'm in the middle of reading time. What's wrong?" "They painted our fence," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "The HOA. They painted over the white fence with this horrible beige without asking us." There was a pause, and I heard her excuse herself from the classroom. When she came back, her voice was tight with anger. "They did what?" "That's our property. They can't just do that." "Well, apparently they can, and they did. I'm looking at it right now." "Did you check the mail? Maybe they sent some kind of notice." I walked back toward the house, my boots crunching on the gravel path I'd laid down myself. The mailbox yielded the usual assortment of bills and junk mail, but tucked between a grocery store flyer and a credit card offer was a letter on official Meadowbrook Hills HOA letterhead. "Found something," I told Sarah, tearing it open. I read aloud. "Dear Mr. Owens, as per Section 7.3 of the Meadowbrook Hills Community Guidelines, all exterior fencing must conform to approved color schemes. Your recent paint job using non-approved white has been corrected to beige, option number 4 from the approved palette. The cost of $350 will be added to your next quarterly HOA dues. Regards, Patricia Hendricks, HOA president." "They charged you for painting over your fence." Sarah's voice had reached that dangerous pitch that meant someone was about to have a very bad day. "Stephen, that's insane. We need to fight this." "Oh, I'm going to do more than fight it," I said, my mind already churning through the numbers. "I'm going to send them a bill." After we hung up, I went back outside and really examined the fence. The paint job was terrible, absolutely terrible. They'd painted right over the white without primer, so the coverage was uneven. There were drips everywhere, like whoever did it had been in a hurry and didn't care about quality. Some sections had brush strokes so thick they looked like abstract art. This wasn't just about the color anymore. This was about someone coming onto my property and doing substandard work that I now had to fix. I'd spent $250 on the premium white exterior paint, plus another $100 on supplies for the original job. Then there were the 3 full weekends I dedicated to properly prepping, priming, and painting that fence. I'd sanded down rough spots, replaced 2 broken pickets, and applied 2 even coats with a proper finish. It had looked beautiful, crisp and clean against the green of our lawn. Now I had to strip all this beige garbage off and start over. I went to my workshop in the garage and started calculating. I pulled up the receipts from my original purchase at Home Depot on my phone, adding up every item. Paint, brushes, rollers, primer, sandpaper, wood filler, painter's tape, drop cloths. The total came to $362. Then there was my time. I worked as a software developer for a company based out of Charlotte, but I worked remotely from home. My hourly rate was $45. I'd spent approximately 24 hours on the original fence project. That was another $1,080. Now I'd have to spend time stripping this mess, repairing any damage to the wood from their sloppy job, and repainting. I estimated another 30 hours minimum. That was $1,350. I sat down at my computer and opened a spreadsheet, laying it all out professionally. Original materials, $362. Original labor at standard contractor rates, $1,080. Paint removal and damage assessment, 8 hours at $100 per hour, $800. Repainting labor, 22 hours at $100 per hour, $2,200. New materials needed, estimated $400. Grand total, $4,842. I created an official-looking invoice with my name at the top and addressed it to the Meadowbrook Hills HOA. Under description of services, I wrote, remediation of unauthorized paint application to private property, restoration of fence to original condition, compensation for property damage and trespass. I set payment terms at 30 days and saved it as a PDF. The next morning, I printed out 3 copies of the invoice, put one in an envelope addressed to Patricia Hendricks at the HOA office address listed on their letterhead, and kept 2 for my records. I drove to the post office on Merriman Avenue and sent it certified mail so I'd have proof of delivery. Then I did what any reasonable person would do in 2025. I started documenting everything. I took probably 50 photos of the fence from every angle, showing the poor workmanship, the drips, the uneven coverage, the spots where they'd splattered paint on my grass. I took photos of the original letter they'd sent me. I made copies of all my receipts from the original paint job. I started a folder on my computer labeled HOA Fence Dispute and organized everything methodically. 3 days later, I got a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. I answered, and a woman's voice that could have curdled milk came through the speaker. Mr. Owens, this is Patricia Hendricks from the Meadowbrook Hills HOA. I received your ridiculous invoice in the mail. Good afternoon, Patricia. I assume you're calling to arrange payment. There was a sound like she'd choked on her own spit. Payment. Mr. Owens, you seem to be confused about how things work in this community. We don't pay you, you pay us. Well, Patricia, you seem to be confused about property rights and trespass laws in North Carolina. You came onto my property without permission and damaged my fence. I'm billing you for the restoration. That fence was painted in violation of community standards. Show me where I signed anything agreeing to your color palette, I said calmly. I'd spent the last 3 days researching HOA law in North Carolina, and I discovered something interesting. Because I've reviewed all the paperwork from our home purchase, and while there's mention of HOA dues, there's no signed acknowledgement of your community guidelines. In fact, I never received a copy of these guidelines until after I'd already painted the fence. The silence on the other end stretched for a good 10 seconds. When Patricia spoke again, her voice had shifted from imperious to calculating. The previous owners signed the covenant agreement. It transfers with the property. That's true for deed restrictions and CC and Artic S, I agreed. But your color palette isn't in the recorded covenants. I checked with the Buncombe County Register of Deeds. Your community guidelines are just a set of rules your board made up, and they're only enforceable if homeowners agree to them. I never agreed. This is absurd. Everyone in Meadowbrook Hills follows the guidelines. Then everyone in Meadowbrook Hills made a different choice than me. I'm happy to be a good neighbor, Patricia, but you vandalized my property. Either pay the invoice or we can discuss this with a lawyer. Your choice. She hung up on me. I honestly hadn't expected anything different. I knew this was just the opening salvo in what would probably be a long and annoying fight, but I was prepared. I'd dealt with difficult people in my career, project managers who thought yelling was motivating, clients who wanted everything yesterday. Patricia Hendricks didn't scare me. That weekend, I started the restoration work on the fence. I went to Home Depot and bought paint stripper, more sandpaper, and all the supplies I'd need. I spent Saturday morning applying stripper to one section of the fence, watching the beige paint bubble up like it was as offended by its own existence as I was. The chemical smell was harsh, even with the respirator I wore, and the work was tedious and messy. My neighbor to the east, a retired accountant named Frank Morrison, came over while I was scraping paint off the third picket. Frank was in his 60s, with white hair and the kind of permanent tan you get from spending every day working in your garden. "Heard you had some trouble with the HOA," he said, leaning on his rake. "They painted my fence without asking." Frank nodded slowly. "Patricia's been getting more aggressive lately. She fined the Johnsons $200 last month because their grass was half an inch too long. Never mind that Bill Johnson was in the hospital having heart surgery. That's insane. That's Patricia. She became HOA president 4 years ago, and it's like it went straight to her head. Used to be the HOA was just about organizing the annual neighborhood picnic and making sure people didn't leave broken-down cars on their lawns. Now she's got all these rules, and she enforces them like she's got a personal vendetta. Has anyone pushed back? Few have tried. Most people just pay the fines because it's easier than fighting. The Martinses 2 streets over refused to remove a shed that Patricia said was too tall. She put a lien on their house. They ended up selling and moving away rather than deal with it. I paused in my scraping and looked at Frank. She can do that. Put a lien on someone's house. HOAs have a lot of power in North Carolina if the covenants are properly recorded. Problem is, most people don't know what rights they have. They just assume the HOA can do whatever it wants. Well, I'm not most people. Frank grinned. I can see that. Good luck, Stephen. Let me know if you need anything. And if you need someone to testify about what the fence looked like before, I'm happy to help. I appreciate that, Frank. I worked through the weekend making slow progress. Paint stripping was every bit as tedious as I'd remembered from helping my dad restore old furniture when I was a kid. By Sunday evening, I had about 20 feet of fence stripped down to bare wood, and my back was screaming at me. Sarah brought me iced tea and helped with some of the scraping, though she had to go back inside after an hour because the fumes were giving her a headache despite the respirator. Monday morning, I was back at my computer for work, joining a video call with my team. My hands were sore, and I had paint stripper residue under my fingernails that wouldn't come out no matter how much I scrubbed. We were discussing a major project deadline when Sarah called up from downstairs. "Stephen, you need to see this." I muted myself on the call and went to the window. Patricia Hendricks was standing in our front yard, taking photos of the fence with her phone. She was exactly what you'd expect, middle-aged, with that particular haircut that seemed to be regulation issue for HOA presidents everywhere, short and severely styled. She wore khakis and a polo shirt with the Meadowbrook Hills logo embroidered on it, like she was some kind of neighborhood security officer. I unmuted long enough to tell my team I had an emergency and would be right back, then headed downstairs. By the time I got outside, Patricia had moved to the side yard and was documenting every inch of my fence stripping work. "Can I help you with something, Patricia?" she turned, and her expression was smug in a way that made me instantly wary. "Mr. Owens, I'm documenting further violations. You're now in breach of Section 7.5, which states that all property maintenance work must be completed in a timely manner. Your fence has been in a state of disrepair for 4 days. It's in a state of disrepair because your people painted over it without permission. That's not how the board sees it. You have 72 hours to complete the restoration or face a fine of $100 per day until completion. I took a deep breath and counted to 5. Losing my temper wouldn't help anything. Patricia, you're on my property without permission. I'm going to ask you once to leave. If you don't, I'm calling the police. I have a right to photograph violations visible from the street. You're not at the street. You're 6 feet into my side yard. That's trespassing. We stared at each other for a long moment. Finally, Patricia sniffed and walked back toward the street, but not before taking a few more photos. I pulled out my own phone and took photos of her as she left, making sure to capture her standing on my property. That evening, Sarah and I sat at the kitchen table going over our options. She'd brought home a stack of papers she'd printed at school, articles about HOA disputes and North Carolina property law. According to this, she said, tapping one article, HOAs can only enforce rules that are in the recorded covenants or that homeowners have explicitly agreed to follow. If you never sign their community guidelines, they might not be enforceable. That's what I told Patricia, but she's going to keep pushing. This isn't about the fence anymore, this is about control. She can't stand that someone told her no. So what do we do? I finish the fence, and I send another invoice for the additional time and materials, including the time I'm losing dealing with her harassment. And if she doesn't pay, we file a lawsuit in small claims court. Sarah looked worried. Stephen, is this really worth it? We're talking about a fence. It's going to consume so much time and energy. It's not about the fence, I said, echoing my earlier thought. It's about someone thinking they can come onto our property and do whatever they want. Today it's painting the fence, tomorrow it's something else. If we roll over now, Patricia will never stop. She reached across the table and took my hand. Okay, then we fight. But we do it smart, right? Documentation, lawyers if we need them, no losing our temper. No losing our temper, I agreed. The next 2 weeks were a blur of work, both my actual job and the fence restoration. I'd wake up early, put in a few hours of coding, then spend my lunch break working on the fence. After my work day ended at 5, I'd be back outside until it got too dark to see. The weather cooperated mostly, though we had one evening where a thunderstorm rolled in and soaked everything, including me, before I could get the tarps down. I documented every hour I worked, every supply I bought. When I had to make a second trip to Home Depot, because I'd underestimated how much paint stripper I'd need, I logged the mileage and time. When one section of fence turned out to have wood damage from their paint job, where moisture had gotten trapped under the thick beige coat and started rotting the wood, I took extensive photos and noted the cost of replacement pickets. Frank came over several times to help, and I tried to refuse because I didn't want to drag him into this mess, but he insisted. I've been watching Patricia bully this neighborhood for years, he said, wielding a paint scraper with surprising vigor for a man his age. About time someone stood up to her. On a Wednesday evening, while I was applying the first coat of fresh white paint to a section of fence, a car pulled up to the curb. A man in his 30s got out, wearing jeans and a button-down shirt. He walked up my driveway with the careful posture of someone trying not to seem threatening. Stephen Owens. That's me. I'm Marcus Chen. I live over on Oakmont Drive, about 3 blocks from here. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine about your fight with Patricia and the HOA. I set down my paintbrush. News travels fast. In a neighborhood like this, are you kidding? You're all anyone's talking about. Look, I wanted to come by and say thanks, and to give you this. He handed me a business card. It read Marcus Chen, attorney at law with a local address. You're a lawyer, real estate and property law, and I've been dealing with Patricia's overreach for 2 years now. She tried to fine me for putting up a basketball hoop in my driveway, said it was an unauthorized structure. I had to threaten legal action to get her to back off, and she still sends me nasty letters every few months. So you understand what I'm dealing with. Completely. And I want to offer my services pro bono. I think what you're doing is important. If Patricia learns she can't just steamroll homeowners, it'll make life better for everyone in Meadowbrook Hills. We talked for about half an hour. Marcus confirmed what I'd suspected. The community guidelines Patricia kept referencing weren't actually enforceable unless homeowners had signed an agreement to follow them. The recorded covenants for Meadowbrook Hills were fairly minimal. Just basic stuff about not running commercial businesses from home and maintaining properties in reasonable condition. All the detailed rules about paint colors, grass height, and approved mailbox styles were things the HOA board had added later, and they only had the force of law if they'd been properly voted on and approved by the homeowners. Has there ever been a proper vote on these guidelines? I asked. That's the million-dollar question. Patricia claims there was a vote 8 years ago that approved giving the board power to create and enforce standards. But I've never seen the actual vote count, and several people who have lived here longer than that don't remember any such vote. So she might be making it up, or exaggerating what was actually approved. The problem is, the HOA keeps all those records and they're not exactly eager to share them with homeowners who might challenge their authority. Marcus gave me his card and told me to call if I needed anything. After he left, I felt energized despite my aching muscles. I wasn't alone in this fight, and that made all the difference. By the end of the 3rd week, the fence was done. I stood back and admired my work, the crisp white pickets gleaming in the afternoon sun. It looked even better than the original job because I'd taken extra care with the prep work this time. Every surface was smooth, every coat even, no drips or imperfections. It was the kind of fence that would make a home improvement show host weep with joy. I took extensive photos, then went inside and updated my invoice to Patricia and the HOA. The final total came to $5,937. I included a detailed breakdown, photographs of the damage their paint job had caused, documentation of all my time and materials, and a cover letter explaining that this was my final invoice before I pursued legal action. I sent it certified mail, same as before, and copied Marcus Chen on an email with all the documentation. He wrote back within an hour, "This is solid. If they don't pay, we have an excellent case for small claims court. Keep me posted." A week passed with no response, then 2 weeks. I was starting to think Patricia was just going to ignore me when I got another letter from the HOA. This one wasn't from Patricia. It was signed by someone named Vernon Harper, who identified himself as the HOA's attorney. The letter was full of legal language, but the basic message was clear. The HOA rejected my invoice, considered it frivolous and potentially fraudulent, and demanded that I pay the original $350 fine for the unauthorized paint color, plus an additional $500 for the extended period of property disrepair, while I'd been stripping and repainting the fence. I forwarded the letter to Marcus, who called me immediately. They hired Vernon Harper. Oh, this is going to be fun. You know him. Everyone in the local real estate law scene knows Vernon. He's expensive and he likes to bully people with threatening letters. But he's lazy. He won't actually take something to court unless he's absolutely sure he'll win. This letter is all bluster. So what do? We call his bluff. I'll draft a response, lawyer to lawyer, and we file in small claims court. The filing fee is about $200, and we can include that in what you're seeking. How do you feel about making this official? I thought about Sarah's question from weeks ago, whether this was really worth it. I looked out my window at the fence, bright white and perfect. Then I thought about Patricia's smug face, about Frank's stories of other neighbors who'd been bullied, about Marcus and his basketball hoop, about the Martinses who'd been driven out of their home. Let's do it. Marcus filed the small claims lawsuit on a Thursday morning. By Thursday afternoon, my phone was ringing. It was Patricia, and she was furious in a way that made her previous calls seem friendly by comparison. You have sued the HOA. Do you have any idea what you've done? I've initiated legal action to recover damages for property vandalism and trespass. Pretty straightforward, actually. This is going to cost the HOA thousands in legal fees. That money comes from homeowner dues, Stephen. You're hurting your neighbors. Then pay my invoice and we can drop the lawsuit. Pretty straightforward solution. We will fight this to the bitter end. Vernon says your case is nonsense and that you'll be laughed out of court. And when we win, we're going to pursue our own lawsuit against you for the legal fees. Looking forward to my day in court, Patricia. See you there. After she hung up, I realized my hands were shaking a little. This was really happening. I'd sued my HOA. There was no going back now. The next few weeks were tense. I got a nastily worded letter from Vernon Harper calling my lawsuit frivolous and threatening to countersue for harassment. Marcus sent back an even nastier letter that basically said, "Bring it on," in legal language. I received a notice from the HOA that I was being fined for various violations, including leaving my garbage cans visible from the street for more than 12 hours after pickup, parking my truck at the wrong angle in my driveway, and allowing a weed to grow in my flower bed. The garbage can thing was particularly absurd because I'd brought them in the same day as trash pickup, just like I always did. The wrong angle parking was completely fabricated. There was no rule about how to position your vehicle in your own driveway. And the weed was a black-eyed Susan that Sarah had deliberately planted. I documented everything, took photos, and sent it all to Marcus. He assured me it was actually helping our case because it showed a pattern of harassment in retaliation for me exercising my legal rights. Sarah was stressed, though she tried to hide it. The HOA had started sending her nasty looks during the neighborhood, which was tough because she was naturally friendly and liked being part of a community. One evening, I found her sitting on the back porch, staring at the fence. "Do you regret this?" I asked, sitting next to her. "Regret what?" "The fight." "I know this is hard on you." She was quiet for a moment. "I regret that it's necessary. I regret that Patricia is such a miserable person that she has to make everyone else miserable too. But I don't regret us standing up for ourselves. That fence is beautiful, Stephen. You did amazing work twice. We shouldn't have to feel bad about that." I took her hand and we sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set behind our perfect white fence. The court date was set for 6 weeks out. Marcus and I spent hours preparing. We organized all my documentation, my receipts, my time logs, my photographs. We prepared a timeline showing exactly what had happened and when. Marcus found 3 other homeowners who'd had similar issues with Patricia and the HOA, and they agreed to provide written statements. Frank offered to testify about the before and after condition of the fence. Marcus said we probably wouldn't need witnesses for small claims court, which was supposed to be informal, but it was good to have backup. 2 weeks before the court date, something unexpected happened. I got a call from a woman named Deborah Winters. She identified herself as a member of the HOA board, though I'd never heard of her before. "Mr. Owens, I'm calling to see if we can resolve this dispute without going to court. I'm listening." Several members of the board, myself included, were not aware of the fence situation until the lawsuit was filed. When we looked into it, we found that Patricia had authorized the fence painting without consulting the full board. That's not proper procedure. Okay. We've had a board meeting, and we'd like to propose a settlement. The HOA will pay for your materials costs, $362 for the original paint job and $400 for the restoration. We'll also drop all fines that have been assessed against you. I did the math quickly in my head. That's $762. My invoice is for $5,937. We can't pay for your time, Mr. Owens. You're not a licensed contractor, and frankly, the amount you're charging per hour is excessive. It's standard contractor rates in Asheville. I looked it up, and whether or not I'm licensed doesn't change the fact that the HOA trespassed on my property and damaged it. We're trying to be reasonable here. Reasonable would have been not painting my fence in the first place. Or at least asking permission. I'll see you in court, Miss Winters. I immediately called Marcus and told him about the offer. He laughed. They're scared. That's a lowball settlement offer if I've ever heard one. They know they're going to lose. Should I have tried to negotiate? Not unless you're willing to settle for less than you deserve. They came in at less than 15% of what you're asking. That's insulting. If they'd offered 50%, I'd say consider it. But this, no way. The night before the court date, I barely slept. Sarah and I got to the Buncombe County Courthouse early, dressed in business casual like Marcus had advised. The courthouse was an older building in downtown Asheville, all marble and wood paneling, and it smelled like old paper and floor polish. Marcus met us in the hallway outside the courtroom. He had a leather folder thick with documents and looked completely relaxed, like this was just another Tuesday for him. Which I supposed it was. "They're here," he said, nodding down the hall. Patricia was there with Vernon Harper, who looked exactly like I'd imagined, expensive suit, slicked back gray hair, and the kind of face that suggested he'd been born with a briefcase in his hand. There were also two other people I didn't recognize, presumably other HOA board members. We all filed into the courtroom when the bailiff called the case. The room was smaller than I'd expected, with just a few rows of benches and the judge's bench at the front. The judge was a black woman in her 50s with sharp eyes that suggested she'd heard every possible excuse and lie in her years on the bench. "This is case number 2025 SC 1847, Stephen Owens versus Meadowbrook Hills Homeowners Association. Mr. Owens is representing himself with assistance from counsel. Miss Harper is representing the defendant. Let's keep this brief, people. I have 30 cases on the docket today." Marcus leaned over and whispered, "That's Judge Rachel Thompson. She's fair but no nonsense. Stick to the facts, don't get emotional." The judge asked me to present my case first. I stood and walked to the small podium, feeling weirdly nervous despite all the preparation. I explained the situation clearly. The unauthorized painting of my fence, the poor workmanship, the time and money I'd spent fixing it. Marcus had helped me prepare a visual presentation, and I passed copies to the judge and to Vernon Harper. "Your Honor, the defendant trespassed on my property and vandalized my fence without permission or notification. They then attempted to charge me for this vandalism. I had to spend significant time and money to restore my property to its original condition. I'm seeking compensation for my costs plus damages for the trespass." Judge Thompson flipped through the documentation, studying the photographs. "These pictures show a significant difference in quality between the defendant's paint job and the plaintiff's work. Mr. Harper, what's your response?" Vernon Harper stood, and his voice had that particular patronizing tone that certain lawyers use when they think they're smarter than everyone else in the room. Your Honor, the plaintiff's fence was painted in violation of established HOA guidelines. The association was within its rights to correct this violation. Furthermore, the plaintiff is not a licensed contractor and cannot charge professional rates for his labor. You dispute that the association painted the plaintiff's fence without permission. The association has authority under the community covenants to maintain community standards. That's not what I asked. Did the association paint the plaintiff's fence without his explicit permission? Yes or no? Vernon Harper hesitated, and I could see him calculating. The association provided written notification of the violation and subsequent correction. After the fact, I interjected, and the judge held up a hand. Mr. Owens, I'll direct questions to you when I need your input. Mr. Harper, when was this written notification sent? The letter is dated the same day as the correction was made. Judge Thompson looked at Vernon Harper over her reading glasses. So the association painted the fence and then told Mr. Owens they'd painted it. That's not advance notification, counselor. That's an after-the-fact announcement. The plaintiff had been warned his fence was in violation. I'd never received any communication from the HOA about the fence until after they'd painted it, I said, and the judge looked at me. You have proof of that, Mr. Owens. I've provided all correspondence from the HOA in the documentation. The first letter about the fence is dated the day they painted it. There's nothing before that. Marcus stood and added, Your Honor, if I may, we've also included evidence that Mr. Owens never signed or received a copy of the HOA's community guidelines until after this incident. The enforceability of those guidelines is questionable. The judge made a note on her pad. We'll come back to that. Mr. Harper, does the association have any documentation showing prior notification to Mr. Owens about the fence violation? There was a long pause. Finally, Vernon Harper said, We'd need to check our records more thoroughly, Your Honor. In other words, no. Let's talk about the quality of work. Mr. Harper, the photos show significant defects in the association's paint job, drips, uneven coverage, and what appears to be paint damage to the grass. Do you dispute this? The association hired a professional painting contractor. Then you hired a bad one. Next question, why didn't the association seek Mr. Owens' permission before entering his property? As I stated, the covenants give the association authority to maintain standards. Judge Thompson pulled out a document from her own file. I took the liberty of reviewing the recorded covenants for Meadowbrook Hills before this hearing. They mention maintenance of common areas and restrictions on commercial use of properties. I don't see anything giving the HOA authority to paint private fences without owner permission. Do you have a different version of the covenants? Vernon Harper's confident demeanor was starting to crack. The association's community guidelines expand on the basic covenants. And did Mr. Owens agree to those guidelines? They're standard for all homeowners in the community. That's still not answering my question. Did Mr. Owens specifically sign an agreement to follow these guidelines? Marcus stood again. Your Honor, we've investigated this thoroughly. There's no signed agreement. The HOA claims there was a community-wide vote years ago approving these guidelines, but they've been unable to produce documentation of that vote or proof that it met the voting requirements in the original covenants. The judge looked at Patricia, who'd been sitting silently next to Vernon Harper. Miss Hendricks, you're the HOA president, correct? Patricia stood, smoothing her skirt. Yes, Your Honor. Can you produce documentation of this vote authorizing the community guidelines? I'd have to review our records. So no, you can't produce it right now. Sit down, please. The judge made more notes. Here's what I'm seeing, Mr. Harper. Your client trespassed on Mr. Owens' property, performed unauthorized work of questionable quality, and then attempted to charge him for it. The legal authority for doing any of this is, at best, unclear and at worst, non-existent. Do you have any evidence that would change this interpretation? Your Honor, HOAs have broad authority to enforce community standards. This is well established in North Carolina law. When those standards are properly adopted, and when the HOA follows correct procedures, yes. I'm not seeing evidence of either here. Mr. Owens, walk me through your damage calculation. I'm seeing just under $6,000. Break that down for me. I went through each line item, explaining the materials costs with receipts, the time I'd spent with detailed logs, and the rates I'd used. Your Honor, I researched standard contractor rates in the Asheville area for fence painting. The average is between $75 and $120 per hour. I used $100 per hour, which is in the middle of that range. And you calculated, what, about 35 hours of labor total. 32 hours for the restoration work, plus the original 24 hours for the first paint job that was destroyed, for a total of 56 hours, plus materials. Judge Thompson did the calculation on her phone. So about $5,600 in labor and the rest in materials. Mr. Harper, does the defense dispute the reasonableness of these costs? Your Honor, the plaintiff is not a licensed contractor. He's essentially trying to charge the HOA for his hobby. Fixing vandalism isn't a hobby, counselor. If someone spray paints your car and you have to pay to fix it, that's not a hobby. It's repairing damage. The fact that Mr. Owens did the repair work himself rather than hiring it out doesn't mean his time has no value. If anything, the association should be grateful he didn't hire a contractor who would have charged more. I had to suppress a grin. Marcus had been right. Judge Thompson was fair and she wasn't buying Vernon Harper's arguments. The judge leaned back in her chair. Here's my ruling. The defendant association is liable for trespass and property damage. However, I'm going to reduce the damage award because I think some of the costs are duplicative. Mr. Owens, you're claiming both your original labor costs and the restoration labor. I'm going to award you the restoration costs and materials, which is about $4,500, plus the cost of your original paint and materials that were destroyed, which is $362. That's a total of $4,862. Your Honor, that's excessive, Vernon Harper protested, but the judge cut him off. No, counselor. What's excessive is your client thinking they can trespass on private property and destroy someone's work without consequences. The association will pay Mr. Owens $4,862 within 30 days. Additionally, all fines assessed against Mr. Owens related to this incident are voided and will not be collected. Finally, and this is important, the association is prohibited from taking any retaliatory action against Mr. Owens. If they do, he can come back to this court and we'll have a conversation about harassment, and I'll consider additional damages. Is that clear, Miss Hendricks? Patricia's face had gone from red to white. Yes, Your Honor. Good. This case is resolved. Next case. We filed out of the courtroom in a bit of a daze. Marcus was grinning like he just won the lottery. That was beautiful. Judge Thompson doesn't mess around. She ruled in our favor. More than that, she completely shredded their legal arguments. And that prohibition on retaliation is huge. If Patricia tries anything else, you can take her back to court. Vernon Harper and Patricia had disappeared quickly, not even trying to talk settlement or appeal. The other two board members who'd come with them, including Deborah Winters, who'd called me about the lowball settlement, approached cautiously. "Mr. Owens, I want to apologize," Deborah said. "Some of us on the board had no idea Patricia had taken these actions without proper authorization. This has been a wake-up call. I appreciate that. There's going to be a special board meeting next week to discuss Patricia's conduct. I hope you'll consider this issue resolved. As long as the judgment is paid and there's no more harassment, we're good." Sarah hugged me once we were outside the courthouse. "You did it. You actually did it." "We did it," I corrected. "None of this would have worked without your support." Marcus shook my hand. "If you ever need a lawyer for anything else, you've got my number, and honestly, thank you. What you did today is going to make life better for a lot of people in Meadowbrook Hills." The check from the HOA arrived 28 days later, exactly 2 days before the deadline. It was a cashier's check for the full amount, $4,862, with no letter or explanation, just the check. I deposited it immediately and sent copies of the deposit receipt to Marcus, just to have documentation that they'd paid. 2 weeks after that, Frank came over with interesting news. "Did you hear? Patricia's resigned as HOA president." "No kidding." Deborah Winters called an emergency board meeting. "Turns out Patricia had been taking unauthorized actions for months, not just with you. She'd been fining people without board approval, threatening liens, all sorts of stuff. The board asked for her resignation and she gave it. Deborah's taking over as president. Good for Deborah. She's already announced they're going to review all the community guidelines and put them to a proper vote. And she's going back through all the fines Patricia issued in the last year to see which ones were legitimate and which ones were just Patricia on a power trip." That evening, Sarah and I sat on the back porch, the same place where we'd had our conversation about whether this fight was worth it. The fence glowed white in the fading sunlight, perfect and unmolested. "Was it worth it?" Sarah asked, echoing that earlier conversation. "Every minute," I said. "Not because of the money, though that's nice, but because we stood up for ourselves, because we didn't let someone bully us into accepting something wrong just because it was easier. You think things will be better now? With the HOA, I don't know. But at least people know they don't have to just accept whatever the HOA says. They have rights. They can push back." Over the next few months, Meadowbrook Hills did change. Deborah scheduled a community-wide meeting to discuss the guidelines, and it was well attended. People who'd been silent about their frustrations with Patricia's leadership suddenly had a lot to say. The revised guidelines that eventually got voted on were much more reasonable, focused on actual safety and property value issues rather than petty aesthetic demands. The white fence stayed white, of course. Deborah personally came by to tell me that the board had voted to allow any fence color that was reasonable and well-maintained, with white specifically listed as pre-approved. Marcus Chen stopped by one Saturday while I was mowing the lawn. I'm representing 3 other homeowners now who had issues with Patricia's fines. Having your case as precedent is making everything much easier. Glad I could help. You did more than help, Stephen. You stood up when a lot of people would have just paid the fine and repainted the fence beige. That takes guts." Life settled back into a comfortable rhythm. Work, home, spending time with Sarah, working in the yard. The fence became just a fence again instead of a symbol of a larger battle. But every time I looked at it, I felt a little surge of satisfaction. About 6 months after the court case, I was working in the front garden when a car pulled up. A young couple got out, looking at the house next door where a "for sale" sign had recently gone up. They walked over to me. "Hi, we're thinking about buying in this neighborhood," the man said. "What's the HOA like?" I stood up, brushing dirt off my knees. "It's actually pretty reasonable now. There was some drama earlier this year, but the leadership changed and things are much better." "Oh, good," the woman said. "We were worried because we've heard horror stories about HOAs. Just make sure you read all the covenants and guidelines before you buy," I advised. "Know what you're agreeing to, and don't be afraid to stand up for your rights if something doesn't seem right." They thanked me and moved on. Sarah, who'd been watching from the porch, came down to join me. "You're giving HOA advice now, apparently." She laughed and linked her arm through mine. "My crusader husband, what would this neighborhood do without you? Probably have a lot more beige fences." We stood there together, looking at our house, our yard, our perfect white fence. It had been a long fight, but we'd won. More importantly, we'd proven that homeowners didn't have to be victims of overreaching HOAs. Sometimes all it took was one person willing to say no, willing to document everything, willing to stand up in court and demand justice. The fence would probably need repainting in a few years, but when that time came, I'd paint it white again. And if anyone had a problem with that, well, I had a lawyer on speed dial and a documented history of knowing how to fight back. Life in Meadowbrook Hills wasn't perfect. No neighborhood ever is. There were still occasional disputes about noise or parking or where property lines ran. But the tyrannical overreach of the HOA was gone, replaced by something more reasonable, more collaborative. People actually talked to each other now instead of sending threatening letters. Problems got resolved through conversation rather than fines. One evening in early fall, the neighborhood had a block party. It was one of those perfect autumn days in Asheville where the air was crisp and the leaves were just starting to turn. Someone had set up a grill, kids were running around playing tag, and people were actually enjoying being part of a community. Frank found me near the dessert table. "You know what the difference is between this party and the ones we had when Patricia was in charge?" "What's that?" People are actually smiling. Nobody's worried about their grass being a quarter inch too long or their car being parked wrong. They're just, living. I looked around at my neighbors, at the community we'd all fought for in our different ways. Some had fought openly, like Marcus and me. Others had fought quietly, pushing for change within the system. But we'd all been part of moving toward something better. Sarah came up and handed me a beer. "What are you two looking so philosophical about?" "Just appreciating the neighborhood," Frank said. "And the fence," she teased. "Always the fence," I agreed. The white picket fence stood in the background of the party, a quiet reminder of what could be accomplished when regular people decided they weren't going to accept unreasonable authority. It was just paint on wood, really, but it had become so much more than that. It was a statement, a victory, and a promise that bullies don't always win. As the sun set over Meadowbrook Hills that evening, turning the sky orange and pink, I felt genuinely content. We'd built a good life here, Sarah and I. We'd fought for our home and our rights, and we'd won. The fence would stand white and proud for years to come, a testament to the simple truth that sometimes you have to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard, even when it would be easier to just go along. And if another HOA president ever came along with ideas about painting it beige again, well, they'd quickly learn what had happened to the last person who tried. The story of Stephen Owens and his fence had become neighborhood legend, the kind of tale that got told to new residents as both warning and inspiration. Some battles are worth fighting, not because they're easy or convenient, but because they're right. The fence was my line in the sand, and I'd held that line. In the end, that was all that mattered, not the money I'd won in court, not the vindication of being proved right, but the simple fact that I'd stood up when it counted. The white fence stood gleaming in the twilight, a beacon of one homeowner's refusal to back down, and it would remain that way for as long as I lived in Meadowbrook Hills. That was a promise I'd made to myself, and it was one I intended to keep.